as meaning-making animals, we're going about making meanings and thinking about meanings all the time in our personal lives, in our political lives, in our job contexts. I don't think anybody can function in the world without some understanding about how meanings are made. I'm thinking very specifically about a Christian worldview that I see as emerging around the end of the 12th century. That there's a worldview which becomes increasingly and widely shared by not just people in monasteries or in cathedrals, but among the laity as well. That this is a worldview which is shared, and it's a Christian worldview that has a cosmology, that has symbols, that is populated with various figures, the Trinitarian apex, and God the Father and Jesus or Christ and Mary, and the saints in heaven, and people come to see themselves as inhabiting that structure. So when I think about medieval Christianity, what I'm trying to do is to tease out the systems in place within that cosmic structure. And one of the things that I'm exploring is the idea that marriage becomes a metaphor for social order around about the beginning of the 13th century, late 12th and early 13th century. When we go through periods like we are now, in which people's ideas about something like marriage are changing quite radically and quite rapidly, people are confused about it, and they cling to an idea that somehow this is an institution that is sacred, must always have been this way, has always been this way, but it's not. So, you know, that the marriage through much of the first half of the Middle Ages was a transaction between families, and didn't have anything to do with the consent of the children. They would be married off, and okay, off you go, and you're going to be married, and didn't have anything to do with the church. There's a lot of social utility in not questioning it, but there's also social utility in questioning it. So we have to have a balance between those two things, between the ability to historicize, to put in context, to question, to say this isn't working anymore, we have to change it, and the processes of tradition and of commitment that we make that keep these things going. Medievalists are very interdisciplinary anyway, so art and literature and other things are things that I studied as an undergraduate and again in graduate school. But the philosophy piece of it, when I first started teaching, my first job was actually as a lecturer in the philosophy department here, teaching medieval philosophy. And one of the things that was very interesting to me was to try to think about the ways in which a philosopher would approach the material rather than an historian would approach the material. And one of the things that it did that was really helpful to me was that it helped me to see the way that people I was looking back at in the Middle Ages thought about it, because they were thinking about the problems and issues much more as philosophers might than they were as an historian might. So this enabled me to get more into their mindset, because one of the things that happens that historians tend to concentrate on the conclusions of the arguments and trace the history of the conclusions, but it's the arguments that were often more significant and more important in the context, how people were arguing rather than what they actually concluded. All of the text material that's primary to me is produced in the Middle Ages. So a project or a process would be figuring out which texts I want to look at, why I want to look at them. Then if it's a text that's in manuscript, I may have to transcribe it, figure out what it says, translate it from the Latin, really make sense of it, try to fit it into a larger text, a context of other texts. So if I'm dealing with a philosophical text, there are varieties of sense making there, just trying to figure out the vocabulary, what the argument is, what the moves are, who the other people are that the person I'm reading is responding to. If I'm dealing with a narrative text, then the structures of those texts are very different from a philosophical text. So vignettes, pieces of narrative, the narrative voice in the text, how the writer is using symbols in the text, how the various symbolic representations of the text are interacting with each other in the text. The goosebump moments for me are when I've been puzzling about something and thinking about something, and then I find a text that confirms everything that I've been thinking about. Being able to find ways to dig back into now very distant pasts or into cultures or contexts that are very different from our own through linguistic or textual analysis and cultural analysis, those are things that I think are just valuable to us in terms of understanding ourselves as meaning-making beings, as human beings.